Good evening in Europe, good afternoon in the US, and welcome to our audience for this ninth lecture in the series of 10 transatlantic lectures organized by the America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven. My name is Dirk Wouters. I'm visiting professor at KU Leuven, a supporter of the fund, and I will be moderating the discussion today. As a reminder, the America-Europe Fund was created in October of last year, focusing its mission on comparing the US and the EU with a view to getting new insights and better understanding of each other from comparative work. The fund has already developed an academic program, a business platform, and is currently working on a research platform that should cover also tonight's theme. So the title of our lecture today is How to Turn on Innovation Growth in Europe and the US. And I'm extremely pleased and proud that we've been able to get three eminent speakers on our debate and our lecture today. Let me first introduce Professor Renil Deverglas. She's a full professor at KU Leuven at the Department of Management, Strategy and Innovation of the Faculty of Economics and Business. She's also a senior fellow at Bruegel and a senior non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. She's also a CEPR research fellow, member of the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium. She was advisor to the European Commission, served on the ERC Scientific Council, and on the EU RISE expert group advising the Commissioner for Research. She's currently a member of VARIO, the expert group advising the Flemish Minister for Innovation. Second, Dr. Robert Atkinson. He's president and founder of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. The ITIF is recognized as a top think tank for science and technology policy, and for shaping the debate and setting the agenda on a host of critical issues at the intersection of technological innovation and public policy. Dr. Atkinson is an internationally recognized scholar, a sought-after speaker, and a valued advisor to policymakers around the world, and a widely published author. Two of his books I'd like to cite: first, Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Methodology of Small Business, and second, Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage. He was appointed to government commissions by 4 consecutive US presidents, Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump. And during the Obama administration, he served as co-chair of the White House US-China Innovation Experts Group. Finally, Dr. Jacques Bugin, who is currently teaching business strategy at Solvay Business School. He's a consultant for the United Nations regarding scaling digital ventures and an investor and board member in a variety of companies and ventures, including the Portulans Institute, Fortino, Antler, and Marquardt Media. He was director in McKinsey's Brussels office and co-lead of the McKinsey Digital Economy Initiative. He was also director of the McKinsey Global Institute, the firm's business and economics research arm. He has led numerous research efforts on global economic trends, such as globalization, productivity, and inclusive growth, as well as on the impact, opportunities, and challenges of technology, including big data, the future of work and skills, and artificial intelligence. He's quoted regularly in leading international media. So now more about the proceedings for tonight. They are as follows. We will address 3 key questions, which will be introduced by one of the speakers and followed by additional thoughts by the other panelists. And we will conclude with the Q&A sessions. So our 3 questions are, first, where does Europe stand on innovation compared to the US and China? Second, what can we learn from comparing the innovation policies of Europe, the US, and China? And third, what is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on innovation? You can ask questions in the chat box, and I will try to pick up as many as I can within our 90 minutes. If speakers want to intervene, please unmute if you are muted. So now let's turn to the first question, and Professor Deverglas, may I ask you to lead in the first question? As an introduction, where are we today? In its innovation scoreboard, the EU proclaims it is outperforming the US and China, and yet its GDP growth lags behind the growth in both of these other regions. Europe is also falling behind on adopting and investing in digital innovation. So where do we stand, and what are the key drivers of innovation in today's economies? Professor Deverglas, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Div, for this very nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I hope this works. Can you now see my screen? Yep. Okay. So I want to show you a few numbers on where Europe is on the innovation landscape, on the global innovation landscape. So my university is from 1425, but my data will be a bit more recent than this year here. So now I cannot seem to move my screen. Why is this? Okay, sorry. Trying to, yeah. So if we diagnose the EU's R&D deficit, we usually look at all the expenditures that go to innovation, but that's composed out of public funding and funding by the business sector. If we look at the deficit that Europe has relative to the US, Japan, but also increasingly China, this deficit is most pronounced on the business side here. So the business R&D deficit is the one that, particularly with respect to the US, is the most important one, and it's also one that's actually very persistent. We already had the 3% goal set in Barcelona already a long time ago in order to catch up, and the 3% was 2% business and 1% from the public sector. The 1% we've made more progress on, but the 2% is still far away, and that business gap is very hard to close here. Now, in the early analysis we did on this issue, we argued that this missing gap that Europe has in terms of business R&D was due to the fact that we were missing young leading innovators in particularly new innovative sectors here. And so that what we were missing was a bit of Schumpeterian creative destruction, where lots of new companies come in and with new ideas and new offerings. And if we're missing that, then of course our business R&D will always be lower here. And that's also what the data show and still show, is if we look at, so within the business sector, the share of young companies responsible for business R&D, that's way lower in the EU as compared to the US. So we have few younger companies active in R&D as compared to the US. And we also have much less in innovation-based growth sectors. So those are actually the sectors where the most dynamics are in terms of innovation. So these are sectors like biopharma, but also particularly digital. So those are the ones with the most opportunities for innovation. And in those, particularly those innovation-based growth sectors, we have way less of our companies active in, of our R&D companies active in. Once we would control for this, so if we, so the few companies that we have in these innovation-based growth sectors, and particularly the young ones we have in those sectors, they do as well as the US. So basically that analysis shows that the overall business R&D deficit that Europe has is a bit of a composition problem, is the fact that we have fewer young companies, and particularly companies in the innovation-based growth sectors, which are young companies here. So we would have to change that mix here if we really want to catch up here. So it's not so much about making sure that our existing companies in our established sectors, which are mostly like engineering companies and automobile sectors. So those established leaders, they do fine, but they are not the ones that will be driving our business R&D performance here. But so that was what we did a couple of years ago. But of course, in the meantime, we do have a changing global corporate R&D landscape with a number of important trends. So first of all, in terms of geography, there is a clear shift to the east. We used to compare always with the US, but now increasingly we also have to compare with China. The rise of China is important. In terms of technology, In terms of sectors, the rise of digital technologies is very important, whole digital transformation here. And in terms of institutional characteristics, we do see an increasing concentration on superstars with winner-take-all in many sectors here. These superstars are not only the need to be big, but also these superstars are very often also incumbent firms here. So contestability of this superstardom is also an issue here. And with all these important trends, the question is, given that we were already in a business R&D deficit before, are these trends going to help us to get out of that R&D deficit, or are they just going to make that R&D deficit even more difficult to cross? So just a few numbers to show these important trends. So in terms of geographic shifts, so if we look at all the large R&D spenders in the world, that's what you can find in the corporate R&D scoreboard by the European Commission IPTS. So these are the 2,500 largest R&D spenders. There you see, first of all, you see already that Chinese companies are really increasing in numbers in that scoreboard here. Of course, to the detriment of the EU and the US firms in that sample here. They're not yet so much in the lead as really the top 1% of corporate spenders here. They're still pretty small, but they are making very important inroads here. So definitely Chinese companies are increasingly also on this global corporate R&D scene. In terms of the sectoral shift, so I mentioned the rise of digital. So digital companies, be them hardware, microelectronics, chips producers, components manufacturers, but also and particularly ICT services, are increasing in numbers in this R&D scoreboard. So in terms of the importance of sectors in the R&D landscape, the digital sector is now the biggest and most important sector responsible for corporate R&D. Cars was important for Europe, but is shrinking in relative importance here. The other important sector for the corporate R&D landscape is the biopharma. And if we take the position of Europe in each of these sectors, you do see, and that's what you see on the right picture here, is that cars is the most important sector for Europe here in terms of its corporate business landscape. While ICT, the digital here, that's where Europe is actually relatively less represented here. That sector is way more important for the US and for China, also increasingly for China here. So the US strength is in digital sectors, and that's the growing sector and the sector with the most opportunities for innovation. China is specializing in these digital sectors too here, and the EU stronghold is in automotives, but that's not the sector with the most opportunities for innovation-based growth here, and we missed the digital growth here. So in that respect, the digital transformation is something that explains further Europe's lagging behind. A third important characteristic I identified was this characteristic of the winner-take-all dynamics here. You really have to be big and leading in order to be most effective, most productive here. And if that's the case, we get a concentration in only a few big winners here. Is that also what we were seeing in R&D? Well, R&D has always been a highly concentrated landscape, in the sense that you really needed the big companies represented most of the R&D expenditures here. So if you want to explain what's going on in terms of business R&D, it's really the top companies, the top spenders that drive a lot the overall performance. So that we have always seen, so it always has been quite a winner-take-all, this R&D landscape, and it hasn't really increased over time, but simply because it's always been important here. We don't see that has become even more concentrated than before, with one exception, and that's in digital services, where we do see that indeed the top 1%, so that's really the top of the top, which have been in growing in importance here. So a little bit of more concentration in digital services, but overall this has always been a very concentrated market here. But what matters also is not just this concentration on leading firms and the importance of being in the top, but also these top companies are very often the persistent leaders here. So the incumbent innovators keep on persisting in terms of leadership, and it's very difficult to have new players becoming sufficiently big that they would be the new leaders here. So that persistency is very strong also in general in innovation here. And particularly in sectors like the vehicles here, where Europe is very strong, but also in biopharma. Most of the companies that are in the lead are incumbent leaders here and have been in the lead since decades here. This is actually a little bit less in ICT. So in ICT there is more turbulence. There are new leaders coming in here, new young players, which can. Again, it's important that these new players very quickly take up leading positions, so become winners here, but these can actually be new winners here. So in that respect, ICT is highly concentrated. It's a winner-take-all here, but there is much more turbulence and room for new players here. But now let's look at then if this is the new landscape, global landscape in terms of innovation, what's the position of Europe in these three important sectors: digital, biopharma, and vehicles. And then we look at only the top 10% of the spenders, R&D spenders in those sectors here. And this is what you see over time. Europe is the red bar here, and you see that in terms of digital, Europe is not well represented at the lead here, and it's actually losing, even losing position, which is mostly due to the fact that the leaders that we had in digital were mostly in the hardware. Think of Nokia, think of Ericsson here. But the shift in digital has been going to digital services and the network companies, and that's where Europe completely lost out here. And that's where the US is very strong, dominant force here. Increasingly also China here, but it's particularly the US which is dominant at the lead in these digital services here. Biopharma is a bit of a different story. It's also a very important story in terms of innovation, but there Europe, and of course with Europe we still include the UK and also Switzerland here, certainly for biopharma. These are important countries too. So there both the EU and the US are important at the lead here. The US somewhat more important, but still. So there Europe has actually still maintained with its big pharma companies important positions at the frontier here, and for the moment Asia and China is not yet there. But then the other story is the vehicles. That's really where Europe dominates at the top. It was important in terms of R&D leadership, also has increased over time, but more recently also that position has become a bit more under threat with the green and the electric car revolution here, where the European incumbent innovation leaders have actually been slow to be on that trend, and where companies like Tesla, but also Chinese companies, have actually moved ahead faster than Europe. But European incumbents are now also reacting here, so still have to see to which extent these incumbent innovators like Volkswagen will still also be able to maintain their advantages in the next wave here. So overall, and that's my last slide, what does this changing global corporate R&D landscape mean for EU's business R&D deficit? The high winner-take-all incumbency characteristics, and especially in digital technologies, leaves the question of whether there is room for new players here who can displace incumbent leaders, so that we could really have this creative destruction Schumpeterian dynamics here. it could be that the markets will become way more concentrated on these incumbent winners here, and there will be much more difficult for new players to take up important positions. And that would mean for Europe, since it is or needs to be in catching up, particularly in digital here, would there be room for new next generation leaders that are European here? And that is just something that we will have to discuss in more detail here, particularly with the US being very strong with much more creative destruction potential here, and also China, which are able to come up with new leading players here and are able to deal with creative destruction, even if those competitions are winner-take-all here. So I'm very much looking forward to what my other panelists' views are on whether whether Europe can actually tackle these challenges here. Thanks. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Renilde. Jacques, you also recently wrote a report on innovation in Europe. I presume you have quite a few thoughts and or comments to what Renilde presented. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk, and Rob and Renilde. Great to be on panel with you guys. Renilde, in your discussion, I thought first it was very interesting and eye-illuminating. We all know that obviously Europe has a few challenges in terms of innovation, but allow me to make two comments first. The very first comment is in terms of the statistics you have produced. First, it's not a game of average, as you just discussed. It's a game of the two extremes. Either you are in the startup world or you are in the big guys like the big pharmas and the big software companies, you name it. And we know that today you have talked quite a lot about the high end. On the low end of the startup, we all know that we have deficits. I think in the last a few years, I guess this year was about 41 billion of money from VC being poured into startup in Europe, but still the deficit is still there. So before we can get creative destruction, we still need to make sure that we have enough of these entrepreneurs to be funded to basically create a market dynamics at this stage. That's a gap in Europe. The second point is that you talk a lot about R&D is one type of intangible, but there are just many types of other intangibles. If you think about database, intellectual properties, and you name it, I think Europe is spending 1.7 point of GDP lower than the US, for instance. So the gap is not specifically on the marker of innovation and R&D spending. It's pretty much across all the dimensions of intangibles, and that's a bit worrying. And from a scope point of view, we can think about R&D just for the sake of growth of companies, but as we know, the beauty of innovation from a welfare point of view is that it has brought a lot of longevity in our case, and you know that very well given COVID. If we don't have any vaccines to inject to people, I don't know how many more infections we would have. So roughly 1/3 of the increase in longevity, in my own estimates, has come from innovation. And today, if I look at the number of patents that we have in biotech, yes, we have a few, but when we go one step further in terms of synthetic biology, for instance, in that field, we're pretty much 10% of the total and 90% is from the US. So again, that possibly creates a picture which is even broader than the one that you have said, where we have some problems. Now, if you look the next phase, which is the digital aspect, I think what digital brings is again a darker picture than the one that you have made in one way. Because again, if you look at the patent that comes from digital in terms of big data, quantum computing, and the like, again, there we are half as many patents and R&D spending than the US is doing. So again, there we have a deficit. Two, we run into a value chain problem in the sense that when you talk about our friends of the automotive industry, I would say that it's not only that it's a green revolution, it's an electronic revolution, and everything is moving into a software revolution. And if you like, the hardware of the platform is likely to be either US or China. And so in one way, you rely on them. I know at this stage that the incumbent companies are trying to fight back and try to develop their own platforms, but it's still a big bet that they will win. I think it's possibly too late. At least the value chain and the distribution of value possibly will spill over back into the US, like we have seen in the classical software industry, the telecom and Apple, for instance. And last but not least, again, what worries me is that when we talk about digital, I think the digital that we've seen so far is not a digital that we will see tomorrow. I think we are pretty much in the stage of digital transformation where all the building blocks are starting to dominate digital against the analog world. And in that one, it's all about artificial intelligence. It's a lot about big data. And by the way, we did a lot of work, actually for the European Commission, where we estimated that if we want to close the gap in productivity from the past only against Europe and get the same momentum as we had in the 1960s, for instance, you know, possibly 1 to 1.5 points of growth a year could come from the adoption of AI. The only problem today is that AI, in terms of data, in terms of everything else, it's still pretty much a mix of game between the US and China. So all that together raises the same question as you have. We not only have an R&D problem, we have a distribution problem, we have a value chain problem, we have a beyond economic welfare problem. And by the way, we are slowly but surely losing into that digital momentum. No, sustainability is possibly the one that we are looking at as a way to catch up, but even there, sustainability will be enhanced by digital and by changing the incumbency of energy issues. And last but not least, even in the sustainability elements, I think the fact that we say we're going to solve the problem by 2050, it's like a joke to me. I think if we can solve the problem by 2030, then innovation will come. And as you look today from the ESG point of view of sustainability, the problem is still a lot of marketing versus really doing. And the guys who are winning the sustainability game are the people that are actually innovating in terms of product and services. So we're back to square one, which is that it's not about marketing, it's a lot about innovating. And there as well, Europe is losing. I stop here because I don't want to be, self-inflicting myself as an European, but I think it's a wake-up call that we need to be conscious of.
Rob, really interested to get your views, because with all the stark views from Europe, we hope that from your end you see some sunshine at the end of the rainbow.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you. So, you know, the great thing about listening to this, particularly, well, Rahel, I really enjoyed that. It's really fascinating data you presented and good analysis. And Jack, I always enjoyed hearing it. The great thing about listening to you is I feel less pessimistic now about the US. So thank you. Really appreciate that. In all seriousness, though, just a couple of points maybe to build on what both of you said. You know, number one, I think that there's two main things going on in the world, economically, institutionally, industrially, technology. And one is Mark Andreessen's quip that software is eating the world. I just can't underestimate that enough. You know, if you're not a software-based industry or firm, you know, you're just not going to. Now, you know, maybe haircuts. Okay, I get that. Maybe haircuts won't be software-based, but lots and lots of things are going to be software-based. And with all of that things around it, so you know, platforms, data, AI, IoT, all that means. And I don't really, you know, at the end of the day, it's interesting if you look at some of the work on Japan. You know, why did Japan kind of fall behind? Japan, one of the main reasons they fell behind is their software economy was just so much weaker than ours, and it had to do partly with they didn't embrace high skill immigration the way we did. It had to do with kanji characters and all that. But I feel like Europe is maybe not as far back as Japan was, but Europe is an engineering, to me, when I think about Europe and it's an engineering culture, it's an engineering system, and it's great at that, chemical, mechanical, electrical even, but it's not a software system. Ours is a software system. I mean, we just did that, and largely because I would argue because of the historical effect of the Defense Department and needing advanced software to compete with the Soviets militarily. And so we just funded, great universities and supported companies, by happenstance. The second thing is, I think the other thing that's happening today in the world, and this is a hypothesis, so it's not a fact, but I think what we're seeing is the platformization of the economy. So I think it's quite similar to, if you've ever read Alfred Chandler's work, Strategy and Structure, for example, the famous historian, economic historian from Harvard. What Chandler was really talking about was the rise of the industrial managerial corporation with divisions and all that, and that was transformative. That was that was almost as important as the underlying technology. Well, how did that play out back in the 1890s, 1900s? All that. The way it played out is we took advantage of that, and you did not in the same way. Largely because of antitrust, you still allowed you allowed cartels, and because of allowing cartels, European firms could continue to be smaller and just sort of collaborate. We didn't allow cartels. But the mythology of U.S. antitrust is that we were anti-size, anti-merger. We were not anti-merger. You just couldn't get big by cheating. So yeah, we broke up Standard Oil Company, but there's a great line from Teddy Roosevelt, early president of the U.S. in the 1900, and he said, "I'm not against big companies, and I don't want antitrust to break them up, but I want government to regulate them. I want government to make sure that they act in the public interest." So we took advantage of that wave better than anybody in the world. And now my worry is that Europe is approaching platforms in the same way. There's sort of almost an underlying sense that the existence of a platform is problematic and has to be adjusted and structured and regulated in almost like the old model. Like a platform economy is going to be a more concentrated economy. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but it doesn't mean big giant platforms on everything. I mean, this is where I think Europe still has, I know what you're saying, Renaldo, but I don't think Google's going to go away until somebody figures out a completely new internet architecture, or I don't think Facebook's going away unless somebody, maybe blockchain is the disruptor, but they're not going to go away without a Schumpeterian technology disruption, in my view. But at the same reason, Siemens didn't go away. I mean, Siemens has been around for 140 years, and they've never gone away. But I think there's a lot of ability or opportunity for smaller platforms to really take off. Just to give you one example, my son graduated from a computer science degree, again, kind of an American thing to do. He got a CS degree in machine learning, and he ended up working for a little startup company backed by Kleiner Perkins in Silicon Valley called Farmers Business Network. And it's basically a platform, a data and analytics and AI platform for farmers in North America. And, I would imagine that at some point, they have one competitor, I think, but at some point once that market takes off, there's not going to be a lot of entry in that because you've got lock-in. And I don't mean lock-in in a bad way. You're just using that and you've got all the advantages of it. But there's there's hundreds of more of those opportunities. And I don't see Europe sort of jumping at that. I mean, if Europe went first on a farmers business network, they could come to the US and dominate. So at some point, I assume, I don't know anything, but I assume a company like Farmers Business Network will, after they've worked in the North American market, they'll start going to Europe and Asia and have advantages because of already their scale and learning. So anyway, I'll stop there. Look forward to the discussion.
Can I make the reactions to Rob, and it's the reactions to mine as well, which is the game of average. When you talk about Europe, you make an excellent point, which is it's a bunch of engineering culture, but on top of that, it's a political grant. And at the end of the day, if you take UK, you get 1/3 of the value of innovation already out. But again, if you look at countries like, fascinating countries, by the way, if you look at Holland, if you look in Sweden, per capita basis, they are as innovative, even better innovative than most of the US. In the US, if you take out Silicon Valley, I would argue that Stockholm as a city has more potential than most of the cities that you have in the US. And if you look at Klarna, ADN in payments, or if you look at the B2B space, we see a lot of innovation. So it's not that we don't have innovation, it's that structurally we are just not at the level where we can run the race and get the platform at the level where we can. And the second observation I wanted to put as well, which you alluded to when you talk about Chandler, is that at the end of the day, what I find very interesting is that innovation per se is not coming in a vacuum. It comes because you have managerial skills, it's because you have a way to compete. And at the end of the day, if you look at whether they are managerial fads, it could be that as well. But when it comes to managerial efficiency, it always comes from the US, and they just run closer to the frontier faster than we do, and that means that they have more money to spend and do possibly some mistake innovation, but they have the freedom to try much faster and much bigger than we do, and that's one of the caveats we have in Europe.
Yeah. So can I also, yeah, that's right. So I love this discussion. I'm very happy to be part of this panel here. So let me try to pick up on a few points that both Jack and Rob have mentioned. So in terms of the averages, I'm really looking at not just only the top, but also this startup scene here. So indeed, we do have startups, but the problem is really these startups should be able to grow to critical size and become the next leaders here. And that's scaling up problem. That's really an important issue here. Why does R&D matter and other intangibles that would matter? I think it's true. So other intangibles are definitely also important, but they complement each other here, like you say. So in order to really turn innovation into commercial success, you need also other intangibles, organizational skills, marketing skills, and whatever. And they are complementary, but innovation and how much you spend on R&D will of course be important. And the more stronger other intangibles you have, the more incentives you will have to innovate and to invest in the next new ideas here. So in that respect, I think the R&D picture gives a good view on because it reflects incentives for building new sales. In terms of are we also running behind in biopharma? You mentioned that, Jacques. Are we missing like in synthetic biology? I do think that we are not yet missing the boat, in the sense that incumbent firms may be still a bit slow on picking up new, and that the US, and particularly again the new startups are bringing the new ideas here. Also think of our vaccines here. The mRNA came from Moderna, from BioNTech here, but what seems to be working much better in biopharma is you have a lot of these startups and which can grow, but then in the end, big pharma collaborates, takes over these companies, and then they're able to use their strength in terms of financial strength and production and value chain capacities and whatever, in order to bring these startup ideas into much more success. And European companies are also able to do that as well as US companies here. So I don't think we've missed it. We missed it there. We might. Our big pharma companies may be a bit more slower to pick up these new ideas here, but they do. And in that respect, I do think that's not yet, hopefully, a lost game here. In digital, though, it's another story here, and I do agree fully with what you what have you been saying, is that it's not just only a problem of R&D and patents, but really a whole value chain problem here. And I think we should definitely, for digital technologies, we should really also be looking at, is there room for Europe for the adoption of digital technologies in those sectors where we do have some kind of strengths here. And the car sector is one very important sector here. How effectively we're going to adopt digital technologies for the next generation of cars, that's where the discussion will actually be. Then the question is, will our our strong incumbents, Volkswagen and whatever, will they be able to capture the value from these new digital technologies here, or will it be Google with his autonomous driving car will be the one that is benefiting here? And so that's my whole question I still have in terms of, yes, a lot will be in how good we will be in digital adoption and big data and algorithms and AI adoption here in the sectors where we do have strength. Will we be sufficiently strong, or will, in order to capture the value from that, or will it still be the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons which will be supplying these software and AI algorithms? Will they be the one that captures the value also in the sector, in the health sector, which is also about who will be adopting the new big data digital technologies as well? So that's for me the major question here. So on the one hand, will we have on these platforms enough European startups that can work on these platforms with big tech, US and Chinese big tech companies, and capture the value from that? And will our big companies be able to adopt these technologies, digital technologies, in these value chains and be capturing the value here? That's the question, but I don't know the answer.
Unless anybody wants to make one final reaction to what Renilde said, I would suggest then that we turn to the next section on policies, because interesting enough, we see why there's quite a few questions on policies. But Rob, is it okay if I ask you to lead in this section with comparing the innovation policies between Europe, US, and China? We'd really like to get your view.
Absolutely. So thank you. So a couple of things. We've done a couple of fairly major reports on that for the listeners, if you're interested, at itif.org. One was a report from 2019, which we did at behest of the Finns, who were leading the European Council that year. It was called Supporting EU Growth and Competitiveness in the New Digital Era. And in that report, we actually had a whole long section comparing the innovation ecosystem and policy ecosystem in Europe, Japan, China, and the US, those 4 countries or regions. And then more recently, just last year, we had, or just this year, sorry, we had a report called Who is Winning the AI Race, China, EU, and US, where we looked at about 18 different quantitative indicators on that. I'll give you the punchline of that one. The answer is the US. And the US is leading, China's catching up, and Europe is unfortunately in the metrics we had in the 3rd place. So before I jump into the positive, I just want to say sort of what's the problem here? And the problem to me is in any of these conversations is about one of 3 things, or all 3 of productivity, innovation, and competitiveness. Those are sort of 3 things that go together. Europe lags the US and China in productivity growth, although the US has been slowing down. We've heard from Renilde in particular on innovation, R&D. The EU lags on triadic patents. For example, they have essentially the same number of triadic patents every year as the US, but obviously it's a significantly bigger economy, so it should have more patents. And we both exceed China, although again, they're catching up. I do want to mention the competitiveness part, because even though the EU still lags behind on innovation metrics, you're still doing pretty well on competitiveness. And I just would point out that in 2019, the EU ran with the US $160 billion trade surplus, and not just in less technology intensive industries, pharma, motor vehicles, machinery, instruments, measuring instruments, electrical apparatus, $160 billion trade surplus with the US. So you're doing something well there. In contrast, the US had a relatively paltry $1.8 billion trade surplus in cloud and internet. And yet, when you listen to the dynamic out of Europe, it's, oh my God, the sky is falling. The US is it's taking advantage of us. President van der Leyen recently said that the goal of the EU is to achieve technological sovereignty in critical technology areas. I have to say, from an American point of view, I'd be fine with that as long as we could have technological sovereignty in motor vehicles. I'm tired of being dependent upon the Mercedes platform. I'm joking, of course. But I think what the president is really meaning there is consumer-facing digital platforms, digital companies, and I guess I would sort of reinforce what Reinhilde said is that's done. It's over. It's done. Nothing's going to change on that one. There's no way, in my view, that it's basically that's a U.S.-China game for search, for platforms. It's a U.S.-China South Korea game for smartphones. I would look for other areas, particularly in the B2B space. But that's done, and I don't really why should Europe even waste their time on it, because you're not going to be able to do it. Let me talk about sort of 5 main differences or areas where I would see differences in terms of policy and an innovation ecosystem and environment. The one is first of all is on the internal market. The U.S. has had a strong internal market ever since we wrote the Constitution and mandated it, and then build infrastructure. That's just, to me, I don't think you can underestimate the benefits of that, particularly to startup companies who can scale very, very quickly. China now has the same size market as we do, more or less, and then if you throw in their Belt and Road dependencies, it's even bigger. The EU obviously still struggles with that. It's a bigger economy than the US, but it really doesn't have the single market that makes it easier for entrepreneurs to scale, or big firms to get scale, really. So that, obviously you got to go back to that. The second is, and you asked me to be, Dirk, a little bit maybe provocative from an American side, and I will be, and that's, I think if you look at one other key thing for success in the digital economy, and that's scaling. The IT system itself is a technology that leads to scale. Just like machines and electric motors in the 100 years ago led to scale, companies that would adopt those big companies had 10 times the horsepower per worker 100 years ago than small companies. So IT is enabling scale, and also innovation benefits from scale. Yet when you look at that, and this is what we did in our book, Big is Beautiful, the average firm size in the US has increased. It's now about 22 workers. It doesn't sound that big, but you got to remember there's millions of companies that have 2 workers or 5 workers. So the average firm size has increased in the US, but according to the Commission, it decreased in Europe, and is about 1/3. So the average firm size in the EU is about 1/3 of the size of the US. China is going whole hog on supporting large, medium-sized and large firms because they understand the criticality of that to going out and competing. They force their companies to merge. You can see that in high-speed rail, where they forced 2 major companies to merge into CRRC. The other thing is, I think that dynamic is only going to get more. When I look at AI, I think in terms of companies using AI internally, as opposed to buying an external service, like I mentioned, these farmers buy an external AI service, but companies using AI internally, that is a game of scale. The costs are high, the fixed costs are high, the marginal costs are low. My hypothesis is that it's just, we're not going to see 10-person, 20-person firms using AI on their own very much. It's more like the 500-person firm, the 10,000-person firm. And yet, when you listen to the European dynamic, I'm on this global partnership for AI, and I listen to my European colleagues just constantly going on about how the key in Europe is to get small firms to adopt AI. I'm, call me skeptical. I just don't see it happening. So what does that mean for policy? I think what it means is Europe ending its fixation on SMEs. Whenever I bring that up in Europe, they say, well, we have to do that because we have so many of them, which is really a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have so many of them because you give them so many benefits and exemptions from regulations and the whole 9 yards. So you have a lot, and then you keep doing it. I think at the end of the day, Europe's going to have to use an American phrase, bite the bullet, and gradually enable either scaling or, frankly, some of these SMEs just going out of business and being replaced by medium-sized or larger European firms that have the capability to do what is needed in the technology and the competitiveness system. I also, frankly, think that means rethinking antitrust for an innovation era. We talked just before this about EU auto firms, and are they going to be dependent upon, let's say, Google? Well, if I were running DG Comp, I would allow the EU auto firms to form their own platform. Have them all work together to create an AI, autonomous vehicle platform. My sense is that DG Comp would not support that. But if you don't allow that sort of collaboration and cooperation, I don't see how you can get the scale to compete against the Chinese or the US. The third area would be in terms of entrepreneurship. And we know this, everybody talks about it all the time, but I can't stress how important that is. Chinese, you compare China to Japan on almost any indicator, attitudes, startups, they're just vastly more entrepreneurial than Japan. And the US is vastly more entrepreneurial, or I shouldn't say vastly, significantly more entrepreneurial than Europe, although probably Europe has been catching up as older people move out of the labor force and younger people move in. I think the younger people have been inculcated with an idea of startup cultures, but it's still a slog. The EU has half as many AI startups as the US, even though, again, they're a bigger company. There's a quarter less venture funding in Europe for AI as in Europe. So what could you do? Well, I mean, one thing we did in the US 30 years ago is we, through a bunch of different mechanisms, partly from foundations, we established over 200 entrepreneurship education programs in universities and colleges around the country. So pretty much every business school has a dedicated entrepreneurship program. We have a college called Olin College, which is a fascinating engineering program. Half of the students are approximately are women, so it's really groundbreaking. Each student is trained from the very day they get there in design, engineering, and entrepreneurship and business formation. They have twice as many new business startups by their students as MIT does. So there's things countries can do to just say we are going to support more entrepreneurship. Reforming universities. One of the best things about the US is our university system is oriented, not all of them, but oriented to entrepreneurship. So the last two I just mentioned, one is really the regulatory system. And in the book that Dirk mentioned that my colleague Stephen Nozell and I wrote called Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage, we essentially formulated this innovation success triangle. And on one side of the triangle were things like the business climate, the business culture, the types of businesses. So things like how much venture funding there was, business attitudes, managerial skills, et cetera. And on another was just pure technology policy. And then the third was the regulatory system, including everything from social and economic regulation. The US approach to regulation, in spite of what I think some Europeans might think, we're not a libertarian country. We don't have cowboy capitalism, quote unquote. We actually do regulate, but we more or less usually apply the innovation principle to regulation. We think about the impact of regulation before we design the regulation on the negative effects on compliance costs and on innovation. China, they don't even think about that stuff by and large. They will do anything to innovate, and regulation to them is the only reason they regulate is they want to punish people for violating the thinking of Xi Jinping, as we saw with Jack Ma. But in Europe, you get this very strong sense that Europe thinks that regulation is a source of competitive advantage. If we have the strongest regulation, somehow we will gain, perhaps because that is somewhat of a Gulliver strategy. Well, if we can regulate the leaders and slow them down, maybe we'll catch up. It's also based upon, I think, very unassumed, unexamined assumption, which is somehow that regulation leads to trust, which leads to adoption. And it's a very dubious statement that I think needs careful analysis before one builds an entire regulatory system around it. So, there's certainly a lot of things that Europe could do, including Brussels. For example, they have a regulatory scrutiny board, which supposedly looks at regulations, but they don't look at regulation. They're not charged to look at regulations from an innovation perspective. The last would be, as I mentioned before, is really software and CS. China is very, very good on that now. They graduate more CS graduates than we do, but obviously they're a bigger place. The US is fantastic on that, particularly at the PhD level, but also at the undergraduate level. Like I'm assuming this is true in Europe, but certainly was true in the US in the last 6 or 8 years. The number of CS programs that really, really embraced AI and machine learning and natural language processing, et cetera, just had to do it. So it suggests that Europe has really got to double down on software, whether that's expanding funding to software programs at universities, whether it's making sure that each member state teaches real computer science in high school. Those to me would be all good things. So let me stop there and just say, I think at the end of the day, there's a question about Europeans, how could Europe be an innovation leader? And I think there's two main sort of thoughts. One is if we just have some better EU programs, and we just have maybe a better R&D tax credit or more EU funding, it's more of a kind of like a structural thing. Or is it more cultural and institutional and just sort of deep-seated resistance? I mean, I always think one of the reasons why the US leads in GMO, it's pretty easy why we lead in GMO, because Europe didn't want GMOs. And now GMOs are going to be critical to climate change. I mean, GMOs are going to be super important, not just to produce crops that can help with climate, but produce crops that are climate resistant, climate change resistant. So anyway, obviously both are needed, the institutional and, the structural and the cultural institutional, but interesting to see sort of how that all plays out. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, Jacques or Renilde, do you want to react? I did
okay,
the question. Go ahead.
Renilde, you want to start, or do I comment first? You're still on mute, so I'm going to stop.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I can go first. So thanks a lot, Rob. I think you really set the scene for how difficult the policy challenge is for Europe here. I think what's a very important point you made is we should be very clear on what the target should be. We should not be fighting for getting to the next digital platform. Google companies here, that should not be the target. We should look for other areas where we can really build strength. That still evolves quite a lot around adopting the latest technologies, which are digital technologies, but could also be new materials or whatever. It will be based on innovation. That's where we will capture but the question is, can European firms capture the value from these innovations? Do they have the right kind of incentives here? And that's on the one hand, small startup companies, if they really want to, and they will be using these platform economies from other leading companies here, but can they, when they're using this, still capture the value from their innovation? And that's, I think, where policy will come in, to make sure that you have clear incentives, and that these companies can actually capture the value from their unique innovation assets that they can deliver. And that requires setting the right framework conditions for being able to capture the value. That means definitely so of course single market will be very important, making sure that markets are sufficiently open. So that's for Europe, the single market agenda, but also keeping our markets internationally open. But competition policy will also be a very important instrument here, because these platforms are actually there are large companies which do have advantages and efficiencies, and also innovation efficiencies definitely, but definitely we need very careful analysis by competition policy whether they're not abusing that size in terms of dominance here, such that our younger companies can actually also capture value on using these platforms here. So competition policy, I think, will become a very important part of innovation policy in future. And the same for regulation and the whole design of the patent mechanism as well. Also making sure that that's really safe for innovation, not just only innovation by the big incumbent firms that have all the advantages of size and the platform that they're having, but also for the companies that are using these platforms here, and also those innovators that are disrupting potential positions of the incumbent firms here. So yes, the market will be winner take all here, but we have to make sure that particularly our competition policy, regulatory instruments, making sure that that's innovation proof, like you mentioned, but not only innovation proof for the existing incumbent firms and technologies and innovation, but also innovation proof for the drastic innovations that come from new players here. And I have to say, I think, so the EU has to work on that, but the US also has to work on making sure that it has that kind of innovation proof competition policy and regulation as well. And then, of course, there is also the financing. I think that's always a big discussion. How much public money should we spend on innovation here? Should we support our innovators here? Again, what I would like to say is we have to be really careful is that we are trying, public funding should go to those that really need it, where there is a market failure here. And we have to really make sure that our young companies, when they do have great ideas, they don't need to sell to larger companies or to others simply because they're lacking the finance for that and because there are financial frictions in the market. They need to sell and to partner with large companies because they need the competences of these large firms, not because they need the financing of these large firms here. That's what the financial market should solve, and if the financial market does not, then that's where financing should come in from the public sector here. So again, to make sure that our innovators can actually capture the value on these platforms here without having to turn into partnerships with larger players where they would lose out simply because they're lacking the finance here. So yeah, that was my take on
Kijk,
this.
any thoughts?
Yeah, a few ones. So first reactions to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Rob's on your point of, I have a sympathy, by the way, on the point you make about, Europe wanted to have at least a fallback in terms of its own independency. We all know from the politics that not having that kind of things is obviously difficult to stand. And by the way, if you only look at what happened to Boeing in terms of airline, I would say that I like to have Airbus in Europe. But joke apart, I will want to make two observations. One about what I think Europe has done as mistake, and two, a few ways where Europe could still do a lot of very interesting things, which today is still a wide space because people don't comment too much about them. So if I look at the mistake of Europe, I think the first mistake has been that they comply too much to the dogma of the single market, which is the consumer is king and it's all about consumer surplus. I agree with that. The only problem is that when we talk about digital and everything else, there's just so much knowledge spill over that at the end of the day, if you say data needs to be in the control of every citizen, at the end of the day, possibly you can have a consumer surplus which is protected, but you have a very small market. And at the end of the day, you have to rebalance the kind of dogma and the tools that you have to make sure that it's not about comparative static, but really about dynamics and spillover effect. And at this stage, I don't think that the tools are well thought through, but at least using the wrong tools or the obsolete tool for the kind of competitions we will have is possibly a mistake of Europe. The second one, which I find very interesting in Europe, is that to get innovation work, you need foresight and you need guts. You need to think about, the 10x kind of elements, and you have to think 2030. But in Europe, everybody is getting old. Everybody is looking in the next 2-3 years. And even from an institution point of view, I always made the point about AI, that you will see the productivity arising from AI only possibly after 2025. And at that time, you would have disruption. Now, if you say that to a politician at the European level or within a country within Europe, the guy will say, I've got 3 years to get re-elected. That's 2024. It's going to be too early for my own payback, so I will not do it. So there's a conflict between the timeline of innovation and the timeline of politicians, I think. And I don't say that we need to get a model which is like China, where people can be, or Russia, where people can get there for 10 years, but at least you have at least that time dimension, which is one of the mistakes we do. And the last one, I think, which is also interesting, is the M&A point of view. I think what we see in the scale-up is not that we don't have a scale-up potential, is that, I take the example of France, for instance, a lot of the scale up at good market share into the mid-market, but then a very big, large company in France going to buy them, and then this thing is absorbed into the that global structure, and then that corporate VC equivalent just die out. So I think it's not a scale up per se, it's a question about how do you manage the M&A there. And again, yes, I know that Google and all these guys will do one M&A a day on the digital side, but it's about building a market. It's not about concentrating a market. And in Europe, I think there's been that kind of case where obviously then you look at this from a perspective of regulatory perspective and antitrust, simply because the large companies prefer to buy the small one instead of letting them go and compete. So that's a mistake they do. No, I'm looking at the opportunities now. And again, they are possibly wrong, but I thought it would be good to put that on the table anyway. The very first one is that we talk a lot about platforms, but what I learned about platform is that the guy who makes the most money on the platform relative to the capital it employs is obviously the keynote, the orchestrator of the platform. But the guy who is very active into the platform and possibly owns one vertical node of the platform actually makes as much money, relatively speaking, in terms of deployment of return on capital. And I think the point here is that we are so good in engineering. Yes, the horizontal play is gone, but the vertical play and the specificity of the vertical play could be very good. In ICT, there's just a lot of things we can do. Look at payments, services. We are pretty good in doing this. So I think there's a vertical play that is much better than the classical best of breed horizontal platforms, where Europe can do a lot, which today it does not necessarily push enough for. I'm not saying we have to go back to industrial policy, but it's close to that in one way. And I think it's much more ecosystem play than anything else. The second one I see as important is that we've got great skills, okay? And the beauty of the skills we have in Europe is that they are not necessarily considered like in the US in the very high expensive schools. They are pretty much something that Europe has done very well, is to democratize a bit more of the scalability. The problem is that we don't have a mobility despite what we claim. The mobility happens when you go to school where you can have a great program called Erasmus, but there is no Erasmus base for managers. And I think that if we can play that role and add a mobility to the scalability, Europe can play the market game much better than what he could be doing. And the third thing is that when the market goes a certain way, think differently. And I take the simple example. If I look at how the US has worked, US basically developed things in Silicon Valley, then go to the UK, and then third step, what do? They go to Europe. And they've done that in the media business before. They've done that in the telecom business before. And that's the road. Now, I work for, I'm an advisor to a company called Antler, which is a kind of accelerator. They originated from Asia, Singapore, but they do a blue back because they just understand that the skills is not fully distributed uniformly based on population, but at least based on certain skills. And actually, you can do a road where you go from, let's say, Singapore and a few Asian countries, go back to Eastern Europe, do something in Africa and Europe, and build an ecosystem around it. But today, again, that road is not exploited. It's a bit of a skepticism about, China is actually owning that kind of that road, and there is no way to play. I think there is quite a lot to be done. So I also believe that one of the problems of Europe is that they don't think strategically, or at least they don't think creatively. It's possibly part of your point, Rob, if I close the loop, is that we are a bunch of engineers, we're not a bunch of creative people.
All right.
Dirk, you're on mute. Dirk, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I was okay. Thank
you
you, Rob. Thank you, Jacques. Very provocative. I'd like to propose maybe we insert a few questions from the audience now, and then before we turn to the final section, which hopefully, which Jacques, I hope we can introduce. The first was actually to Renhilde, but it actually was discussed. But the question is, what are the reasons that Europe missed the digital transformation? Is the concentration on privacy/data protection, in brackets, characteristic of European or German approach, detrimental to digital innovation? Which policy incentives can drive innovative business?
Yeah, well, that's a big set of questions here. So why did we miss the digital revolution? Well, I think it's a bit of a reflection of this missing creative destruction. Here is too much incremental innovations in what we are currently doing here, and missing the completely new growth opportunities here, going into drastically new areas here, and that's why we missed a bit. So we were stuck a bit on the classic improvements of, and we missed actually the new. And that sometimes also happens. It's also the same with cars. So the green technology too, so biopharma also initially too. So we all the new opportunities for technologies that always, yeah, we get stuck way more into incremental and incumbency advantages here. It's partly because we're lacking, I think, this startup scene that's sufficiently strong to really make a change here. So, and not just at the margin, but really making a change and growing to sufficiently quickly, critical scale. And that's partly because we are still a fragmented market, and because we don't have the right incentives for these companies that have these drastic ideas to be willing to take the high risks of this here. That's I think in a nutshell, and that also reflects why we have to be careful that we missed it once, the digital revolution, whether we're going to miss it with the next versions of digital again, and also other big changes here, because we're missing that creative destruction potential.
You know, I would add to that. I think unless you're really familiar with the U.S., you sort of think of the U.S. as a big giant, innovation ecosystem. But actually, in 1980, the East Coast led in digital. General Electric was one of the largest software players. You had Westinghouse. It was really sort of the Washington all the way up to Boston and through to Pittsburgh. That was where the leadership was. And there were a bunch of Silicon Valley startups. I mean, if you think about where did Fairchild come from? Well, Fairchild was a camera company from the East Coast, and they tried to sort of get into that space, and those people were they were shut off. They couldn't understand it, and so that was one advantage we had, is all the crazy people went to Silicon Valley, because they knew that was where they could do this. And so it just started to build upon itself. So it wasn't as if somehow there's something inherent about the US system that made us do that. There were big parts of the US system that were going to fall behind and didn't embrace that and end up losing out. So, I mean, maybe the way to think about that is the comparison between the East Coast of the US and Europe overall. Maybe you need some place, I don't know, maybe Estonia or something like that, where everybody moves who's crazy and wants to take big risks.
But I do think we have as many crazy people as you, relative terms here. But the question is, do we have
they don't all go to one place, though.
Yeah. The question is, do we have the right kind of environment and particularly policy support, or at least not incentive for having these crazy people live their dream, right? And that's where I do think that the US has a bit of advantage in terms of policy here, because particularly also with its public procurement, its defense, DARPA, which are willing to take way more that risk and also bet on these crazy people here, and that we still have to learn in our policy perspective, I think.
May I add two small points to what you guys said. One, we all know that what you decide today is likely to feature what you will do tomorrow. And again, the PC-centric platform was already US-based. And obviously, the people who won the internet obviously use the PC as a platform. Then he moved to the mobile platform, At that time, we were very successful too because we had Nokia. But then we faced the problem of Rob, which is he was a bunch of quiet engineer from Nokia that didn't understand that the kind of capabilities we need to have was much more design and much more platform based, like Apple could have. And so we lost that. But also his story, and I like what Rob said, because I always look back at my life, and at this stage I can say what I knew from that time in 2000, and I look at AOL, for instance. AOL was obviously in the east of the US. When 2000 happened, Google basically tried to sell itself to AOL, and AOL refused. And by the way, it was for 700 million for nothing. Okay. And on top of that, AOL was actually very well entrenched in Europe through Bertelsmann. And Bertelsmann was, alas, an incumbent media company. And at that time, RTL wanted to take AOL and possibly, scale that with the telecom and make it much more creative. And the deal fell through. Who knows that if at that time the deal would have come where AOL would have bought Google, and on the other side, RTL would have taken over AOL Europe and do things, the world would have been changed. But again, it shows you that in this game, some bets are always good. And working in the VC, one thing I learned in the VC world is that the value of a 10x option is worth much more than the value of trying not to be wrong. Okay, and that's the whole point. And that's the whole point. And I think the US has this kind of capabilities, especially because the market is bigger, because the money market is bigger, so people can afford to lose. That's also part of the culture as well. You talk about the cowboy of the US. I don't think that you are the cowboy, but at least you have a wide side that we don't have on that front. And that play the digital stack. Other question there, because we talked too much.
Yes, another one. Could you elaborate more? Could you elaborate more on the green economy? Where do the EU, US, and China stand on the R&D landscape in this sector? Given the high cost for innovation and transformation in this sector, where or which are the most cautious companies, European ones or the American ones? Rob, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be based upon data, so I would certainly not full data. I think a couple of things. One is you basically, whenever you have a conversation about who has more money, the answer is China. Doesn't matter what it is. It's always China, because they have an enormous amount of money and they back their companies. And they, why did the Germans lose solar? It wasn't because the Chinese were inherently better. It was because they just bankrolled the Chinese solar company. So having said that, I think the Chinese are putting lots and lots of money into this. One of the things that was interesting is a few years ago, we proposed this, I can't remember the name of it now, but it was like this global innovation challenge thing that got taken up as part of the Paris Accords. And it was basically countries signed up to commit to double their clean energy R&D spend. So we have a clean energy R&D project, and so we analyzed that, and it was striking how much the Europeans didn't follow through with that. You had countries that actually cut their clean energy R&D after they making a commitment to double. And the US, for all of our faults, even though we had a president who denied climate change, one of the things we did, largely because of Congress, not because of Trump, is we have continued to expand our clean energy R&D, partly through what's called ARPA-E, the DARPA for energy, and other things. So I don't know. I mean, that's number one. I think the U.S. is doing fairly well there, although Europe clearly has advantages with wind and interesting stuff going on now with hydrogen. One last thing I'll say there, I think Europe overstates the green technology revolution, and not from a climate perspective. I mean, if climate's super important, I get all that. I agree 100% with it, and you got to do it. But I believe that Europe thinks that if it wins the climate, the energy technology whole thing, what they call the circular economy, that it's going to lead to our significant global competitiveness across the board. Yeah, there's some of that. I don't doubt that, but I think it's overstated. I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket if I were Europe, and I fear that that's where Europe is going.
Any comments, anybody?
René wants.
Ah, yeah, okay, I'm unmuted now. So the whole green innovation landscape is a bit different, because for green, basically because it's an externality, we also need the right incentives for green innovation, and that's why very important, green innovation needs to be driven by the right kind of incentives, and that means carbon price has to be there, otherwise it will never kick off. And in that respect, I think the EU was doing not too badly, at least in terms of trying to establish. Of course, we can always do better, but relative to the US, we were actually a bit lagging behind. But that's why a lot of US companies actually reacted to the incentives created by the ETS carbon price here. Ideally, we would like to have that on a global scale here. So that I think is really important. Given that we are a bit ahead in terms of our carbon pricing and also our energy efficiency regulations and whatever, I'm still a bit disappointed that in terms of innovation, we could do way better than that, and we still, I mean, I still are not at the optimal there. And I think it's partly also because it's still quite fragmented here, and we cannot really play this out on a global scale here. But the regulatory agenda here is very important for policy to make sure that we get our green innovations running here. But it's not just only the green innovations, then it's also a matter of the business sector adopting these clean technologies in a performance and in a way that it doesn't hurt their competitiveness and their productivity here, so that they actually can combine these new green technologies also with other innovations in their processes and in their products here, so that such that actually they become stronger and it improves their profitability here. So that's why I think, for instance, the combination of green and digital technologies together with new product offerings, that's where our businesses really need to invest more in. And that again links then green innovation is for me also very strongly correlated to having a strong enough innovative landscape in general here, so that these adoptions of green technologies actually become a strength for the companies and no longer just a burden because of the regulatory here. So all the weaknesses that we have in general for innovation will also be translated into the adoption of these green technologies here.
I have a few more questions, but I'm looking at the time, and I really would like to get to the third section for today, which is the impact of COVID-19 of the pandemic on innovation. And Jacques, I know you're doing actually some research on that. So what can you share with us about the lessons learned from your research?
Thanks, Dirk. I just want to add two small points on the previous questions. At least based on my own research as well, I came to the conclusion, at least on my own data, that the circular economy has more potential than the green only. And I like the circular economy because it's a platform thinking. And if Europe is not good in platform, at least they will learn something by doing the circular economy. And the second thing, I think, René, you have said the same thing. You have said it. Sustainability requires digital, and it's not too much about, I understand the green IT debate, but the IT for green is actually more important for me. And that's the caveat. Is Europe going to go on one leg, but it's not ambidextrous because it does not have the digital. And so bottom line, and Rob has said it, Europe has great flow. It's still about data flow and about flows between the countries. They should have competitive advantage and just merge them to work together. And I think that's also one learning of this thing. It's not US against Europe or against China. It's all together. Now, going to the third point. The only thing I wanted to say is that we did some work with Accenture Research, looking at the resilience out of the COVID-19, and in fact, the data that we came to look at pretty much says what we just have said, but within the context of a crisis. And I think what came strong out of the analysis is that's the proof of the pudding, if you like, is that today, if you look at, I'm talking here about the largest companies. I'm not talking about the small, medium enterprise, neither the startup either. we come to conclusion that 1 year after the pandemic, so let's say March 2021, roughly 25% of the companies have bounced back to the same profit growth as before. But that means that, and possibly 1/3 will do it in 6 months' time. But that means that 2/3, and today 75, have yet to rebound. So at least from a profit growth point of view. So it's a very big hit. Now, on top of that, if you look at the companies that managed to be resilient and the guys that didn't manage to get resilient, if you take a simple arithmetics of the average profit, the opportunity cost between the two curves is pretty much 1.5 billion profit per company on average on a company of 5 billion. So that means it is a very, very big decline. And if you look at the companies that are on the non-resilience, we just see the evidence on average that they're just catching up. So they just reached the bottom, but not there yet. So that means that if you take the full curve, you're possibly going to say that Europe will be there, and there are a lot of European companies in that wrong curve. It's going to take 2 years, 2 years and a half for these companies to get back. Now, 2 years and a half to get in a situation where you have to go back to the trajectory of before, it's not only 2 years and a half lost, it's 2 years it's possibly 5 years in competition. And so the fundamental problem of the COVID-19 is that at that time when the market was great, it was easy to make money. Now we see who is very successful. And what we find out in all the statistics on the 35% of the companies that could be the most resilient, Europe has only 30% of them. The recovery on average will take 1 year to 1 year and a half to take the average large Chinese firms. It will take 6 months more for the average US firm, but it takes, again, 6 months more for the European companies to get there. So we talk about end of 2022. So again, a lot of time of struggle is going to happen on the average firm. And by the way, to the point that Reinild has made a few times already, we have the largest proportion of falling angels. These companies that were above average performance, but because of COVID just fell down and are just in that curve. Now, we look at the drivers or the antecedent of that resilience. And again, the story is always the same. Agile innovation is usually the case where if you don't have agile innovations, you're not resilient. And it's a matter of two facts. It's a capability effect, which means if you're not having the capabilities before the crisis, chance that you will have it during the crisis is 0. And two, when you have it, you have another option. You can activate and basically innovate countercyclically just to actually redistributing the profit game into your favor. And that's what we find. 50% of the time, it's about innovation. 50% of the time, it's about reactivation of innovation. And Europe is lower innovation, just lower activation. That's one of the points we make. Now, interestingly enough, we went a bit deeper in going behind the mainstream of resilience and looking at innovation. And obviously, we look at innovation with the context of what we call the twin transformation, which is digitization and sustainability. Again, so we discussed the two are linked, and Europe has a lot of marketing on sustainability, but not a lot of product innovation on sustainability. And on top of that, we're not good in digital. So we lose again on that front. And last but not least, because of the platform game, it's all about ecosystem. We see the structuring of industries moving more to ecosystem where adjacencies start to play out and everything else. It's still very small. It's possibly at best 6 to 10% of the total revenue generated by this large firm is coming from ecosystem, but in ecosystem play as well, Europe is not good. Again, if you look at Alibaba, how much of this revenue come from ecosystem play, it's already 30%. If you look at companies like Deere in the US, it's already 30% of the ecosystem play. In Europe, insurance play with insurance. Sometimes they do bank insurance, like in Belgium sometimes, and then they get hammered by the regulator. But they are basically stuck in the old industry paradigm and not in the business ecosystem. So again, what I mean to say is that the COVID-19 revealed exactly what Reinild has said, which is if you are not innovative, you're not prepared for a shock, and you cannot regain very quickly. Point number two, we are not good in digital. It shows in the statistics of the COVID. And three, we are not embracing the new market structure evolution, which is high sunk costs in digital, Rob's point, industry blurring, which is ecosystem play, which is the consequence of digital. And by definition, because we don't play by that game, we are losing a game. So what COVID tells you is exactly the same thing. When the reality, or when the S hit the van, you start to see the problem of Europe. And again, the politics that are linked to that is exactly the same as we have said. And again, the same thing. René has said a point. We have great biotech firm. You talked about BioNTech. Well, it's a German company. How can it be that he had to do a deal with a US company? We got other pharma that could do it, but again, we have a French champion that never delivered, and because he was a French champion, he could not work with a BioNTech. The same thing. We have a lower innovation intensity, so by definition, no option to rebound. And I think the problem of innovation and R&D is that when you got this thing, when you can reactivate it, you have an option value when you have a crisis that people don't have. And the last source of innovation that we see the most these days is not you innovate. Is you innovate part of it, merge that with open source, all the type of data, and you name it, and you create ecosystem. But we're not building ecosystem in Europe. So again, there is something to be done. And Europe, again, is too much, I think, on the regulatory versus the innovation pushing front. And I will start by one simple sentence that I got from a friend of mine when we were meeting with the European Commission, and he was from China, and they asked the question, why is China so good in catching up? And he says a very simple thing. He said, in Europe, you are possibly the sum of the public spending of all Europe is possibly twice as much as the US and possibly twice as much as China. But the difference of China and US versus Europe is that the biggest customer of Chinese companies is actually the states. Okay, both for funding innovation and for using products. Possibly the same happens in certain type of form in some industry in the US. We don't have that. So we have a procurement system, but we don't have a blend innovation system.
Well, what a way to wrap up. I still want to give Rob first maybe a chance to give final thoughts, and then Renilde, you gave the lead in, so you can also close the debate.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jacques. They're really interesting. I think just two thoughts. One on that, and then one, I really just wanted to go back to something Renilde said earlier. I think that's, I don't know, I'm sort of optimistic about the economic longer.
Optimist.
An optimist, yay! I'm a long-term optimist and a short-term pessimist. How's that? I think that COVID did a couple of things. Number one, it showed companies that they have a lot more flexibility than they thought in terms of how they structure their work, which is weird because we all read in economics class that companies are fully rational, except that they're not when you have system interdependencies. But the second is, I think it's sort of a little bit of a shot in the arm for a lot of companies to say, wait a minute, maybe we should use digital to really restructure. And I think you're going to see a lot of stranded assets happening, which is obviously a cost, but at the same time, a lot of restructuring that will lead to longer term productivity. Just really quickly, one point I wanted to make, Renilde, with what you were saying about making sure we regulate platforms for value capture. See, I actually think that may be one reason why Europe doesn't have very many platforms, is because, well, can we take as much value out of them as possible, and then you don't have any. I know you weren't saying that, but imagine a thought experiment where there's no US platforms. We're just, Europe's its own thing, all European platforms. I just think at the fundamental levels, why do we care who gets the value? What we care about, or what I think you should care about, is that value is created. And so I'm less worried about, I think I see this whole thing in Europe as somehow it's not it's not like putting innovation at the center. It's putting firms. Firms have are given too much preference in Europe. Who cares about firms? I don't care about firms. Firms are a means, not an end. And if you had an innovation that destroyed half the firms in Europe, that's life. That's just the way the market works. I mean, I don't mean to sound callous. I'd want to help their workers and all that stuff. But so I just worry that somehow, well, we don't want to have an unfair playing field. As long as it's based on competition, that's called the nature of competition. It's unlevel playing field.
Yeah. No, exactly. But that's also the point I wanted to make, is the ones that create the value within these chains should also be able to capture that value here, and that's where you need to regulate and the competition environment here. And in the end, it's true, those value chains that are not able to give the right incentives to those that create the value within their chains, they should actually be disappearing. So you need but then you need competition between the chains, right? Between the different platforms. And that's the kind of environment you would need to create. That's what I wanted to say. So, Dirk, if I have to close the session, first of all, I'd like to say I really enjoyed this discussion. It was so much fun and so much good insights from the. So I'm very happy to be able to discuss with Jack and Rob here. I wish we could continue more in future here. So one last remark that somehow perhaps closes a bit this discussion here, and what Jack was saying here. So what you need in terms of resilience was what he mentioned. First of all, you need to have this innovation mindset and this willingness to take risk. You need to be good in digitalization here, and you need this ecosystem play. Those were the three things that you identified as important for resilience. If I hear all of these three, then I'm a bit afraid that China will be the winner here, because they have all three here. So they're very good in innovation. They know how to deal with digitization. And one of their strong points is really how quickly they can build ecosystems here on a large scale. So, but I didn't want to end on a negative note here. So maybe we should just adopt more Chinese into our system. No, sorry. Thanks a lot for the discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I hope we can continue.
Thank you for your wise words. Thank you so much, all three of you, Jacques, Rob, and Renilde, for participating, and thank you also for all people out there listening. And I do hope that the recording we haven't said too many things that will come on YouTube tomorrow, but in any case, have a good evening, and best to all the audience, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.